Okay, good. So now you're going to have an abbreviated session for chapter 10 lecture, which is going to be this one, and the long session, which is from last semester. Okay, so with today, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we're going to take the model of supply and demand, but apply it to the whole economy. Okay, so instead of looking at the demand for a good, we're going to take a look at the demand for all goods and services. So us as consumers, we demand many, many goods and services. We just don't demand just one single good. So we're going to take a look at our demand for all goods and services. And then we're not going to take a look at the supply for a single good, but we're going to take a look at the supply for all goods and services. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply represent the demand for all goods and services and the supply for all goods and services. Okay, but we have a problem. Right from the start, here's the problem. When we talked about the supply and demand for apples, it was very easy to draw a graph where we put, well, let me change this. We have the price of apples, we have the quantity of apples, and then we have here the demand for apples. And it shows, well, at one price, quantity demanded is so much, at P1, quantity is demanded is Q1, and at a higher price, P2, quantity demanded is Q2. And Q2 is less than Q1. Okay, very straightforward. But we know that 2 apples is less than 5 apples, and 5 apples is less than 10 apples. But now we're trying to find out quantity demanded of all goods and services. Now, how are you going to add all goods and services? I can add 2 apples plus 3 apples equals 5 apples. But how do I add 2 bananas plus 3 apples? How much is that? And 2 bananas and 3 apples and 5 shirts and 2 cars and whatever. So how do we add all goods and services? Immediately we have a problem. So instead of adding all goods and services, which you can't, because you cannot add a shirt and a car, what we're going to do is we're going to use a proxy that is going to say instead of all goods and services. So I cannot add 2 apples and 3 bananas. But what I can add is the value of 2 apples plus the value of 3 bananas. Because the values of apples is in dollars, the values of bananas is in dollars, the values of a shirt is in bananas, the value of cars is in dollars. Everything is measured in dollars. And if the quantity demanded is higher, that means that the value of the quantity demanded is also going to be higher. So if we want to get more, then the value of those goods that are more is going to be higher. So fewer goods and services, lower value, more goods and services, higher value. So on this axis, on the x-axis, we're going to add the value of all final goods and services. Well, there's a name for the value of all final goods and services, and it's called real GDP. So on this axis here, we're going to put real GDP, which represents the value of all final goods and services. The more we want to buy, the higher the value. The less we want to buy, the lower the value. Okay. So we have as a proxy for the quantity demanded, the proxy is the value of the quantity demanded. And the value is measured in dollars. So now we have everything measured in dollars. Now, the other problem that we have is that there is no such thing as the price of all final goods and services. We can talk about the price of an apple. We can talk about the price of a car, the price of a sweater, the price of whatever, a haircut, but you cannot talk about the price of all goods and services. Okay, so we're going to have, again, to find a proxy that is going to be in place of the price of all goods and services. And here's what we're going to do. Let's suppose that we want to measure how much we want to buy today, the value of all goods and services that we want to buy today at today's prices. It would be very simple for us to measure the value of everything we want to buy today. We would take how much one person wants to buy, how much another person wants to buy, and then we add all those numbers together. We as a class, as a country, if you will, this class represents a country. So if we add up the value of what everybody in this country wants to buy, then we could say that today, given whatever the prices are today, at today's prices, we are willing to buy $10 trillion worth of goods. The value of what we want to buy, all of us together. So given today's prices, you want to buy $1,000, somebody wants to buy $2,000, somebody wants to buy $500, we add them up all, and we end up with today, we want to buy $10 trillion worth of goods and services. Okay. Now, let's suppose that we want to measure how much we want to buy tomorrow. Okay. What is the value of goods and services that we want to buy tomorrow? But guess what? Between today and tomorrow, something has changed. Prices are not the same tomorrow as they were today. Prices have gone up. We have had some, how do you call that? What's the name when prices are going up?
Inflation?
Yes, we had inflation. We had 10% inflation. Prices have gone up 10%. So if today prices were, let's give it a number, were 100, then the next day, since prices have gone up 10%, what is going to be the price level tomorrow? Hello?
110.
110. Thank you, Noah. Thank you for helping me out. I need help. So it's 110, exactly. See, that's why actually the price that I settle on the original price, it doesn't matter what it was. I made it 100 and then 10% higher is 110. If I had said that the prices were 30, then 10% higher would be 33. If I had said it's 70, then 10% higher would be 77. So the original price doesn't matter what number you pick. It matters what is the inflation between numbers that matters. Okay. So now we have prices equal to 110. Folks, that's the only thing that changed. The only thing that changed was prices went up. Your incomes did not change. Your preferences did not change. Nothing else changed. What do you think is going to happen to the quantity demanded of goods and services that you are willing to buy now that prices are 10% higher? Is it going to stay the same? Is it going to be greater, or is it going to be smaller? The only thing that changed was prices went up. Again, I need a little bit of help.
By
Smaller.
less?
Less, exactly. Less. So we're going to buy less. In other words, quantity demanded of goods and services, or the value of quantity demanded of goods and services, is going to go down. Well, that implies that if prices go up, quantity demanded goes down, and if prices go down, quantity demanded goes up. That means that aggregate demand, the demand for all goods and services, looks just like a normal demand curve. So if prices go up, we buy less. If prices go down, we buy more. Okay, now remember when we talked about how come we have this type of a relationship between price and quantity demanded of a good, I gave you two reasons. One was the substitution effect, and two was the income effect. And the substitution effect basically said, well, if the price of a good goes up, I'm buying less of that good because I'm substituting to other goods. And the income effect went something like this. Well, if the price of a good goes up, it's as if I have less money in my pocket, I have less purchasing power, and therefore I'm going to buy less of this good. Here, when we talk about the quantity demanded for all goods and services, if the price of all goods and services goes up, one of the reasons that we purchase less is going to be very similar to one of those effects here, either the substitution or the income. But the other one disappears. The other one is no longer valid. Can you tell me which one between the substitution effect and the income effect? When we talk about the demand for all goods and services, if the price goes up, if the prices of all goods and services goes up, which one will no longer be valid? Is it the substitution or the income effect? No longer valid. Just a guess.
Income.
If the prices of all goods and services go up, why do you think that you're buying less of all goods and services? Because you are substituting to other things, or because you've been made poorer?
You're made
It's
poorer.
substitute.
You've been made poorer. The substitution effect is no longer valid. Why is no longer valid?
Because everything went up.
Yeah, because there is nothing to substitute. You're talking already about all goods and services. So if the price of all goods and services goes up, I'm going to substitute to, well, there's nothing else. We're already talking about all goods and services. So we're no longer going to have the substitution effect, but we will have the income effect, because when prices go up and our income stays the same, it's as if we're making less money. That inflation is taken away from the purchasing power of our money. And as if since we have less purchasing power, we're going to buy fewer goods. So in the case of aggregate demand curve, here, I'm going to put price level. When price level goes up, quantity demanded of all goods and services goes down. And why is it so? Because one, we have the income effect. Now, for whatever reason, they don't like to call it the income effect, but they call it the real balance effect. Real balance effect is exactly like the income effect. They just change the name. But that's not the only reason why, if price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. Another reason is we have the interest rate effect. And the interest rate effect goes something like this. If price level goes up, then people have less purchasing power. As people have less purchasing power, they're going to start borrowing money. And when they start borrowing money, the price that they pay for that money is the interest rates. So if everybody starts borrowing money, the price of money is going to go up. In other words, interest rates are going up. And as interest rates are going up, businesses will start borrowing less. So business consumption is going to go down. So as at the same time as price level goes up, business consumption goes down. Because folks, remember this aggregate demand, the demand for goods and services, where is that coming from? Well, it's coming from our consumption, business consumption, government consumption, and net foreign consumption. Exports minus imports. So that's where the demand for goods and services comes from. Us, businesses, government, and foreigners. So what happens is, on one hand, when prices are going up, we've been made poorer, and see our consumption of goods and services goes down. Two, the interest rate effect says if the price level goes up, as a result, interest rates are going to go up and business consumption, I, is going to go down. Okay. And we have one more effect. It's called the open economy effect. And whenever you hear the term open economy, that means that trade is involved. Closed economy, there's no trade. Open economy means there is trade. Well, the fact that prices have gone up here in the United States, how is that going to impact trade? And the connection goes something like this. Price level in the US goes up. So we have inflation, prices are going up. Now, people have less purchasing power, so they start borrowing money. Once they start borrowing money, interest rates are going up. So that means that the real rate of interest is going up. Well, think from the point of view of an investor. You're looking at interest rates paying 5% versus interest rate paying 10%. What would you rather have? Would you rather hold a bond that pays 5%, or would you rather hold a bond that pays 10%? And the answer is, of course, you want to hold a bond that pays as much as possible. So when interest rates are going up, investors, they like this because now they're going to get a higher rate of return on their investments, on bonds. Obviously, this is interest rates going up is not good for everybody. If you are an investor, you have extra money to invest. You like that because you are getting a higher rate of interest. If you are a borrower, you certainly don't like that. You would rather pay 2% versus 8%. So interest rates going up is good for investors, but obviously it's also bad for borrowers. So it's a win-win situation. It's somebody wins, somebody loses. Okay, so investors like those higher rates of interest. But it's not just investors here in the US who like those higher rates of interest, but investors elsewhere, in Japan, in China, in France, in Great Britain, all over the world, all those investors want to take advantage of those higher rates of interest that are being paid by bonds issued here in the United States. So they all want to buy US bonds. Why? Because US bonds are paying higher rates of interest. Nothing else has changed in the rest of the world. German bonds are paying the same as they were paying before. British bonds, the same. Chinese bonds, the same. The only place where interest rates has gone up is here in the US. So now all those investors in the rest of the world want to take advantage of those higher rates of interest. So they're buying US bonds. But in order for them to buy US bonds, they have to buy dollars. You cannot buy US bonds with yuans or with yen or with British pounds. You need dollars. So all those investors from abroad, they're buying dollars in order to buy US bonds. Folks, what do you think will happen to the value of the dollar vis-a-vis the value of other currencies when all of them are trying to sell their currency in order to buy dollars? what do you think is going to happen to the dollar? Everybody wants to buy milk. What's going to happen to the price of milk?
Up.
Up. Everybody wants to buy dollars. What's going to happen to the price of dollars?
Go up.
Exactly. So the dollar appreciates. The dollar becomes strong. Well, is that good? Well, let's think about it. Let's think about it. We have accused one country in particular of manipulating their own currency. Any idea what country I'm talking about?
China.
China. Okay. And guess what I might add that we have accused China of manipulating their currency, but without any proof. We just think that they're doing it. Okay, we haven't proved it. But what are we accusing China of manipulating the currency? What are they doing to their currency? And what we're saying is that China is making their currency weak. Well, why would China want to make their currency weak vis-a-vis the dollar? In other words, they are making, when the Chinese currency, when the yuan goes down in value vis-a-vis the dollar, it's as if the dollar went up in value vis-a-vis the yuan. So when one goes up, the other one necessarily goes down because they are relative to each other. Okay. So why are they making their currency weak vis-a-vis the dollar? Well, because when their currency is weak, that means that we will find Chinese goods to be very, very, somebody help me?
Cheap.
Cheap. Exactly. Very, very cheap. Very, very cheap goods means that their exports or our imports will go up. Their exports will go up. They will export a lot more here to the US because we find their goods to be very cheap. And that's going to put to work Chinese workers. So it helps their economy. So let's go back here with the open economy effect. When the price level goes up, again, price level goes up, interest rates going up, then foreign investors want to take advantage of it. They buy dollars. And as they buy dollars, the dollar goes up in value. When the dollar goes up in value, that means that their currencies are going down in value. And now they find our goods to be very expensive. So our exports are actually going down. Now we find their goods to be very cheap. So our imports are actually going up. So you have this guy here, which is exports minus imports, and exports are going down, imports are going up, net exports are going down overall. So quantity demanded of all goods and services here in the US is going to go down because our exports, because foreigners are not buying as much from us because they are finding our goods to be expensive now. So we have the three reasons. When price level goes up, we have less purchasing power, we buy less. When price level goes up, interest rates are going up and businesses will buy less. So first C goes down, then I goes down, and then also NX goes down. Net exports are going down. And because of that, when price level goes up, quantity demanded of goods and services will go down. Okay, now, if price level changes, quantity demanded of goods and services or the value of the quantity demanded of goods and services will change. If price level goes up, quantity demanded goes down. If price level goes down, quantity demanded goes up. But look at this graph. If the price level changes, did this aggregate demand change? And the answer is no. We move from one point on the aggregate demand to another point on the aggregate demand. Just like here in the previous graph where I had a simple demand curve for a single good. When the price of that good changed, the demand did not change. You just moved from one point on the demand curve to another point on the demand curve. If the price changes, quantity demanded changes, but the demand itself does not change. Other things have to change in order for the demand to change. Other things have to change other than the price level for aggregate demanded to change. And as a matter of fact, anything that happens in the world, anything that happens other than a change in the price level, anything other than a change in the price level that causes us or businesses or government or foreigners to buy more or to buy less will change the whole demand curve. Case in point, folks, can you tell me something that happened towards the beginning of the year that decreased significantly the demand for goods and services here in the US and around the world?
The pandemic.
The pandemic, exactly. In other words, people will buy less regardless of the price level. If the price level was here at this price level before the pandemic, people were willing to buy this quantity. Now, less. If the price level was here before the pandemic, this quantity. Now, less. If the price level was here, people before the pandemic would buy here, and now they're buying less. In other words, a shift to the left is a change in aggregate demand. So anything other than a change in the price that causes us to buy more or to buy less is going to lead to a shift, to a change in the whole aggregate demand curve. If suddenly we discover a vaccine for the COVID-19 and we find a cure for it and we feel really good about it, what do you think is going to happen to the demand for goods and services? It's going to go up, right? It's going to shift to the right. In other words, we will buy more, whatever the price level is. So anything that causes us to buy more or less, other than a change in the price, will cause a shift in aggregate demand. But if the price level changes, aggregate demand does not change. You move from one point to another point on the same aggregate demand. Okay. Now, let's move over to aggregate supply. Okay. Now, aggregate supply is going to be much simpler. And it's very easy. Aggregate supply looks at how much firms are willing to supply at each and every price level. Whatever the prices are, how much they're willing to supply. And basically, again, here are the prices, price level. Again, we're not talking about the price of a single good. We're talking about a price level in the economy. And here's real GDP. But with aggregate supply, we're going to take a look at two types of aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply. And the short run aggregate supply is going to look like this, like a normal supply curve, which implies that if prices are going up, then firms in the short run, they are willing to expand. In other words, is going to create those higher prices is going to create an incentive for firms to produce more, because at least in the short run, they are seeing higher profits, higher prices, higher profits. Therefore, you're willing to expand the production of goods. Okay, now let's put short-run aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand together. And if we do that, we have short-run aggregate supply. Here is aggregate demand. And at the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, at this price level here, at this price level, we're going to have where quantity supplied of all goods and services is equal to quantity demanded of all goods and services. So we have an equilibrium. This is the actual GDP. And it's an equilibrium GDP because quantity demanded of all goods and services equal to quantity supplied of all goods and services. Any other price level would lead to either a surplus or a shortage. So the only place where we have an equilibrium is at the price where quantity supplied equals quantity demand. But here's the thing. Just because we have an equilibrium doesn't mean that the economy is operating where it should be operating. So to determine whether the economy is at full employment or not, we're going to have to introduce a new graph. And that new graph is the long run aggregate supply curve. And what does the long run aggregate supply curve tell us? Well, for us, we're going to use it more or less like a yardstick. It is going to be a marker. It's going to be a marker that is going to show where full employment is. And the long run aggregate supply curve is going to look like a vertical line. This is the long run aggregate supply curve. And it shows where full employment GDP is. So this is full employment GDP. And I have many names for it. Sometimes I call it full employment GDP. Sometimes I call it potential GDP. Sometimes I call it desired GDP. Because this is where the economy is at full employment. If we were here, if the economy was here, then we would be operating at full employment. Everybody would be working. Folks, the economy is actually here. We're producing only $10 trillion worth of goods and services, and we could be producing $15 trillion worth of goods and services because that's where full employment is. We are producing less than we could. Is this economy just right? The economy that I'm showing in this graph. Is it an economy that is overheated? Maybe it's doing too good? Or is this economy that is in a recession that is operating below full employment? So what kind of economy we have here where we are actually producing $10 trillion, but we could be producing $15 trillion if everybody was working? So what kind of economy we have in a recession, just right, or overheated?
Recession.
Recession, exactly. So when the actual GDP is below full employment GDP, this gap here, that gap, in my case, I said 10 trillion and 15 trillion is full employment. So that $5 trillion gap is the recessionary gap. So this is a recessionary gap. And the book will also call it by another name. You can call it a recessionary gap. You can call it also a contractionary gap. In other words, the economy has contracted. And what we're going to talk about for the rest of the, not the semester, but until test 2 is, well, what can the government do or should do to move this economy from a recessionary gap to where there is no recessionary gap. In other words, we got to get rid of this recession. Well, what can be done? Well, graphically, you can see there are two things that can be done, but I'm probably going to leave it for tomorrow. I'm going to continue tomorrow with what can be done. I just want to show you a couple more graphs. And then tomorrow we're going to get into what can be done. And again, I'm going to need your help. Let's say that again, I need your help. What do you think about this economy? Long run aggregate supply. Sorry about that. Long run aggregate supply curve shows us where full employment GDP is. The actual GDP, you find it at looking at the intersection of short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and then going down to this axis to see where we are operating. What can you say about this economy here? Not a rhetorical question, folks. Just yell out the answer.
Just right.
Yeah, it's just right. The economy is operating at full employment. There's nothing that can be done. There's nothing that should be done by anybody. The government should stay out of it because the economy is operating exactly what it should be operating, at full employment. Okay. And I have to show you one more graph. Doesn't happen very often, so we're gonna kind of like, this one, there's nothing that can or should be done. But let's say we have this situation here. Well, no, let me get rid of this graph so I can make it nice and big. What do you think about that? What's going on with that economy? Yes. Somebody help? Anyone? No one? Oh my
Well, we
God.
are not using all the resources that we have.
This is full employment GDP here. Let's say full employment GDP is $10 trillion. We are actually operating where? More or less?
More.
More. We are operating beyond full employment GDP. The economy is overheated. Can it happen? Yes, for short periods of time, it can happen. Should something be done? Well, most of the time in this type of situation, it's not going to be the government who's going to intervene. Most of the time is going to be the Federal Reserve, we're going to talk about the Fed a little bit later. But the Federal Reserve, it's the entity that controls money supply and interest rates here in the US. And they will step in. And again, doesn't happen very often, where we say, oh my God, the economy is too hot. The economy is so good, it's too good for its own good. And they're going to step in and they're going to, let's see, what do you think they might do to the interest rates in order to cool off the economy, to slow down the economy and bring it to where the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand take place at full employment exactly. So we're going to end up with the graph that I just showed previously. What do you think that the Fed might do to interest rates to slow down the economy, cool it off?
Raise it.
Raise the interest rates, exactly, raise the interest rates. And the desire, by raising the interest rates, what they are hoping is that borrowers will find it more expensive to borrow money and they're gonna start borrowing less. So therefore, there's gonna be less consumption on the part of us as consumers. We don't wanna borrow money because it's more expensive. Or less consumption on the part of businesses. It's more expensive to borrow money, they're gonna borrow less. And what's gonna happen, this aggregate demand, which comes from our consumption, business consumption, government consumption, net foreign consumption, this aggregate demand is gonna shift to the left, is gonna become less. So it's gonna shift to the left and it's gonna shift to the left until the economy will be operating exactly at full employment. So we're no longer beyond full employment. Okay. Well, what's the, somebody may say, what's the big deal with an economy so good that we are operating beyond full employment? Well, the fear is that of inflation, that this overheated economy will cause inflation. If people want to spend, but there's only so much that can be produced, well, the escape valve is going to be higher prices. If I only have a bottle of water here, and it's almost empty, I got to get a new one. If I only have a bottle of water, and all of you want to buy it, well, all you're going to do is you're not going to make more than one bottle of water, but you're going to raise the price of this bottle. So the fear is that an overheated economy will lead to inflation. Now, the last time that I remember when the Fed decided, actually, the Fed raised the interest rates last year before the coronavirus came out. The economy was, it could be said, a little bit above full employment GDP, and the Fed started raising the interest rates a little bit just to cool it off. It also happened, who knew that the pandemic was going to come, and that was probably not the best idea, but nobody knew. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. Also in around 98, in 1998, the economy was doing very, very well. And the Fed was afraid that it could lead to inflation, and they stepped in and they raised the interest rates. And how much should you raise the interest rates? Well, it's more art than science. And they unfortunately raised the interest rates so much that they slowed down the economy, but they slowed down the economy kind of like here, and we ended up with a recession. Again, it's very hard to determine, well, how much should be raised? Is this much enough? Is this much? Well, if we raise it too much, maybe we slow down the economy way too much. Okay, folks, so let me just give you a name for this gap where the economy is operating beyond full employment. It's not going to happen very often, so we don't have to worry about it. But this gap is called, this gap here, is called an inflationary gap. And the book will also call it sometimes an expansionary gap. So sometimes you will hear that it's called inflationary gap or an expansionary gap. It means exactly the same thing. So the economy is operating at 15 trillion, but actually full employment is at 10 trillion. So we are beyond full employment. Again, doesn't happen very often. And so we're not gonna spend too much time with it. But basically, we're going to spend time with an economy that's in a recession. So the first example, where the economy is in a recession. Okay. And the tools, if the government wants to move the economy out of a recession, it has certain tools. And then if we're talking about an inflationary gap, the tools that the government has in order to close this inflationary gap, to slow down the economy, is going to be exactly the opposite of what the government does to move the economy outwards, to expand the economy. So when we are in a recession, the government will pursue a policy of expanding the economy. When we are overheated, the government will pursue exactly the opposite, to contract the economy here, to bring it to full employment. Okay. All right, so this is exactly what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. So I'm gonna make this chapter 10 part 1, and then we're going to have tomorrow chapter 10 part 2. Any questions so far? So please make sure that you watch also the video that I already have up and going, and then you have another video. Okay, so I'm gonna stop at this point the recording.